You couldn't possibly put a full-length RPG on the tiny Nintendo Game Boy. This system's games would barely last a mid-length journey by car. So how on earth is there a Final Fantasy game for this device? Well, actually, there isn't. Final Fantasy Adventure isn't a Final Fantasy game. You thought the numbering was confusing before? Get ready for this one. The Final Fantasy name was thrown onto this game for marketing purposes, while Japan knew it as Seiken Densetsu, and Europe, who had no idea about Final Fantasy yet, received Mystic Quest. Not to be confused with another later title called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. This was not the first time that the Final Fantasy name was used in North America on a Game Boy RPG, and believe it or not, the Final Fantasy Legends series isn't Final Fantasy either. They went on to be part of the Saga series. Now, focusing on Final Fantasy Adventure, this game is part of the Mana series, and Japan's Seiken Densetsu 2 was named Secret of Mana in English. So, it's settled. Square made both series, but Final Fantasy Adventure is a Mana game. It is, however, still an impressively big RPG on the Game Boy. Now we can finally start. A fairly mellow tune sets the tone, and the first thing to do is name a boy and a girl. Progressive old 1991, look at them letting you name a girl now. The prologue text crawl briefly explains the eternal power of the Tree of Mana and how Dark Lord is seeking it. Not the Dark Lord, his name is Dark Lord. And Dark Lord is forcing innocent people to fight beasts in a gladiator pit for his own entertainment, one of these people being the boy who I randomly named Urpo. That's how the gameplay begins, straight into battle. This battle is totally different to a Final Fantasy battle because, again, it's not Final Fantasy. It plays a lot like a Zelda game, making this an action RPG. Urpo slashes with a sword that he's generously been given, and he can also stab straight ahead for slightly more damage. This fight isn't too difficult, but the beast he defeats explodes upon death, a bizarre feature that continues with all bosses. You'll see very quickly that this is another relatively dark game. One of Urpo's friends dies right at the beginning, and it's not your ordinary RPG death where they'll somehow be revived later. Following a chat with another friend, Amanda, Urpo sets off to escape after his next fight. On his way out, he overhears Dark Lord being informed of the Tree of Mana's power and location from a mysterious man named Julius. They must travel up the waterfall, and there is a spell to reverse its direction. Julius vanishes on the spot using magic powers, and Dark Lord catches Urpo. Guess what? He's mad. He won't let you leave here alive, and now Urpo's got himself cornered on a cliff edge ready to be pushed down the waterfall. That's not the direction you want it to go. This is a really long fall. And he survives. Odds of survival aside, I liked that you're introduced to the overworld by falling into it, making it feel much more unknown. There are a couple simple enemies you'll encounter from walking around, and again it's very similar to Zelda rather than most RPGs. You stay in the overworld to fight, no battle scenes. I thought this helped the game to stay at a good pace most of the time. What I also really enjoyed about this game, compared to the Zelda titles we've seen so far, is that defeating enemies has a bigger purpose. This is still an RPG, and defeating enemies will eventually lead to a level up, improving certain elements about your character. The level up system is surprisingly complex, giving 4 different areas of focus for leveling. Stamina relates to your total HP, while wisdom is all about MP, magic points. You don't have magic yet, so this isn't useful at first. Power is of course the strength of your physical attacks, and will is about the bar at the bottom of the screen. You may have noticed it's slowly filling up, but restarting if you attack. This is your willpower, and I'll just call it will to avoid confusion with the physical power. When fully built up, it can be used for a special attack. No matter which stat you choose to level up, you will always get a minor increase in stamina and will, which makes the level system a little more dynamic. As a result though, you don't really need to choose will level ups. Okay, so that's fun and all, but what about the girl you named? Very early on in your exploring, you should enter a screen with a very distressed pair, and you'll have to defeat the enemies on the screen for them. They're the weakest enemies in the game. Unfortunately, one of the pair, named Hazem, has been seriously wounded. No, fatally wounded. Urpo chats with the other person in a very casual manner, and she reveals that her name is 214? Yes, this is the girl I named at the beginning, and I discovered that numbers and punctuation were hiding below all the letters. You sadly don't play as her, but she will now tag along with you. Now we're mostly set up for how the game plays, and we can move on from the beginning to talk about the game as a whole. There are 2 different menus using either the start or the select button, and you may have noticed an ask function that did nothing before. Asking 214 results in her slowly healing your HP, so there's no need to use healing items. The ask function is different for every character that tags along with you, although this is undoubtedly the most useful instance. There are a few towns throughout the game, and other isolated shops. There are a few items to heal your HP or cure other status effects, and towns have inns that will replenish your HP and MP for only 10 GP. Money is automatically collected from defeating enemies, and you can first use it to upgrade your armor from your starting gear. The next weapon available to buy is the battle axe, first as a more powerful attack, but later to cut down trees in the path, something the game failed to teach properly. Nevertheless, it felt unique to have certain weapons with multiple functions like this. If we look at the plot, it's actually difficult to evaluate. There are a lot of developments, and plenty of them succeed in having some impact, while others lead to more unanswered questions. It's likely that this is from translation problems because it's clear that most of the story should have a large impact on the player, and overall it was enough to keep me interested. There are some repetitions though. Before the first dungeon, 214, is captured, and now your immediate goal is to go rescue her. A man named Man in the first dungeon then tags along, attempting to help take out enemies with his fire attacks, but he's not very good, bless him. More side characters will tag along later too, and those that can attack usually struggle to help. Well, after 2 dungeons, Man can claim he's helped you rescue 214 from a coffin. How foolish of Urpo and 214 to stay in a vampire's house. We know that 214 is very important in this world, as has been suggested even before getting captured for the first time. Wait, what do I mean the first time? Everything will be fine. She's carrying a pendant that's drawing great interest from the important non-playable characters, and soon learns of her role in this world. And then, surprise, Man is actually Julius. I'm starting to think this Julius guy might be more dangerous than Dark Lord himself. And now, 214 has been captured once more. Unfortunately, that character you named at the start expecting to play as is more of a non-stop damsel in distress. A quick aside here, while Square wasn't developing this as a Final Fantasy game, they still included some nods to the series. Some of the sprites are borrowed from it, in particular, the mages. Black mages are now powerful enemies in a few dungeons, while advice-giving white mages can be found in towns. I bring this up now because Julius disguised as Man used a red mage sprite, and red mages can traditionally use white and black magic. I haven't seen anyone comment on this, but I believe he was intentionally given this sprite to secretly convey that he was a double agent. So, here we go again. Now Julius is taking her on an airship back to Glaive Castle, where the game started. Luckily, the airship needs to refuel at a lake, and Urpo is able to climb aboard before takeoff. He can't rescue 214 from the inside, so his next plan is to use the ledge outside the window in her room. But Julius has caught on and cornered Urpo once more, and won't let him leave her alive. Time for another really long fall from the sky, and he survives. He knows the airship was headed back to Glaive Castle, so his foolproof plan is to get back there himself. It would be very poetic to end the game where it started. And he knows his way around, so he's able to find 214 yet again, and tells her to wait outside while he fights Dark Lord. But he hasn't learned. She's gone, taken by Julius, the true villain. She knows the spell to reverse the waterfall leading to the Tree of Mana, and Julius knows powerful magic to keep her under his control. He also knows how to push Urpo down this waterfall, and Urpo knows what it's like to fall this far. And he survives. 214 will always be rescued only to be recaptured immediately, and Urpo will always fall from the sky and survive. Let's face it, the plot isn't perfect, but there's still a really good game developed around it. The game also progresses at a nice pace while allowing you to explore without a real danger of getting lost. There is a map function if needed, although it's very difficult to read. An expressive soundtrack accompanies your journey, and it wouldn't feel like the same adventure without it. I also enjoyed the weapon progression, picking up the sickle in an early dungeon, then moving on to the chain, which could help cross gaps. It's a good available variety of weapon types which get more powerful when you find more later, and you can also discover free armor upgrades. Clearly weapons are done well, but what about magic? Urpo's first spell, Cure, is learned from 214 shortly after her first capture. It's your basic necessary HP boost. 8 spells total are learned in the game, but I sadly only found myself using other magic when I absolutely needed to. I still won't hold it against the game too much, since other people may be more drawn to using spells, and it adds another playstyle. Some enemies can only be defeated with magic, and because it's a good idea to constantly defeat them for leveling up, I frequently use fire after I learned the spell. Before long, however, I almost never use it again. I don't know for sure what some of the spells even do. Ice is necessary for puzzles later on, which turns enemies into snow people. If you have guest characters that can attack, they may even accidentally hit your prized artwork, so these ice puzzles weren't enjoyable. Beyond that, the final spell unlocked is Nuke, which needs exactly 1 use to enter a late dungeon. You could use it for a more powerful magic attack, I assume. I guess there's one thing that really kept me from using magic aside from enjoying the weapons. The menuing, it really isn't good. There are 2 separate menus activated by either start or select, leaving only 2 more buttons for in-game functions. One of these is always assigned to your weapon, leaving the other one assigned to everything else, but only one at a time. Spells and items take this slot, and it's especially frustrating that you have to equip keys to use them, blocking one of your buttons from use. I think I avoided spells to avoid using the menu so often, and there were already a number of times I needed to change weapons due to their secondary functions. Most of the problems that I have with this game are within the dungeons, and I gather this is very common. These are naturally the times you'll be using the menu the most, running into occasional locked doors, or mining certain walls open with Maddox. These are items that you need to buy in shops after they're introduced, and it's necessary to stock up on them. I don't mind checking walls for the most part, since you could listen for a sound without wasting Maddox life, but it was a serious mistake to not hand out these items when they were needed in dungeons. And I guess just any key works on any locked door. Now, if you open a locked door or a wall with a Maddox and then backtrack too far, the passage will be resealed. That itself is poor design, but it is also possible to get yourself entirely stuck inside some dungeons if you're out of keys. Final Fantasy Adventure generously allows players to save anywhere at any time, which is usually a positive, until your file is suddenly ruined forever. This never happened to me, but I'm very aware of it. My playstyle led me to have too many keys going into dungeons, which was lucky in the end. I was glad the Maddox became irrelevant after collecting the Morningstar, my favorite weapon. That's partly because of another glaring issue: the inventory space has taken a vacation. I can't be too surprised considering what this game is already doing to the Game Boy hardware, but even so, one tiny page of inventory space is not enough to face what the game asks of you. All in all, Final Fantasy Adventure is a game I admire, and I didn't let those big mistakes get in my way. Sadly, I have to say the game slightly overstayed its welcome, and after Urpo's third fall, it feels stale. The robot chocobo walking on water is fun until someone gives you the wrong directions. I ended up using a guide for most dungeons from here because everything was getting repetitive. The ice cave at least had a unique gimmick. A guide typically isn't necessary if you don't mind a few wrong turns, although nobody was ever going to figure out what palm trees and 8 meant as a clue. I also got bored of the dungeon music despite it being well suited. The loops were short and again repetitive. Most dungeons contain bosses, and I thought they started off surprisingly hard but well designed. I don't know if it's because of the level up system, but they seemed to mostly get easier, which somehow made an unfair boss in Lich feel welcome. My other big comment on bosses is how they move at a much slower frame rate than everything else, and it's very messy, especially with bosses like the Megapede, who covers a lot of ground. Eventually, Urpo climbs another tower to get back to Glaive Castle, where this time no one is waiting for him, and he can ride the reversed waterfall upwards to the Mana Palace. I realize I've skipped some plot here, and that's because I think you should play it yourself even after everything I said. Mana Palace is a suitably long final dungeon with a few dragon bosses in the middle. These actually were difficult, and I was glad to see this difficulty even though I died several times. Saving anywhere is very nice to have for this. 12 floors later, our hero is approaching the Tree of Mana, and a spirit of the tree is there to give one final weapon to stop Julius, Excalibur. You might recognize the spirit from earlier, when 214 saw a vision of her mother. You can't just have the victory that easily though. Julius already tapped into the tree's power, and 214 is still possessed. With Excalibur on our side, it's time to battle for the world, and ultimate power leads Julius to create 2 clones. It's kind of easy. The tree's power isn't that simple though, since there's always a second phase, and in this case as a monster. It's kind of easy. Now 214 seems back to herself, if a little dazed, so your job must be done. But no, in this game, there's a third phase as another monster. It's terribly designed. The first 2 phases of the battle were indeed easy, but designed well, and the final phase is not difficult with a terrible design of Julius disappearing and appearing on random locations. He appeared directly on top of Urpo an unbelievable number of times. With 214 back at your side, however, you can use the ask function for her to cure you once again, which was necessary for this messy fight. A less random pattern should have been implemented. Despite the legends of the tree, Julius can be defeated, sadly costing the tree's life. It's not exactly a happy ending, and it's very different to see a retro game full of tragedies like this. It turns out that 214 was destined to become the new Tree of Mana once the previous tree was destroyed. I didn't fully understand the concept, and I suspect translations got in the way, but it was clearly linked to her mother's spirit around the tree. Urpo will now guard the tree, leaving others to live happily ever after, sort of. Some of them have lost loved ones too, and many sacrifices were made along the way. You have to hand it to Square. Although it probably wasn't a good idea to try to make an RPG like this on the Game Boy, I believe they pulled it off with flying colors. Still, they possibly should have toned some elements down, as disappointing as it may be to give in to the hardware limitations. The lower difficulty may be suitable for a long Game Boy game, but I still feel that this game would benefit from a proper difficulty curve, which could help the monotony as the game draws on. If you can leave aside the glaring issues, and if you're happy to deal with some retro quirks, I hope you'll agree that this is a great game. Therefore, my final score for Final Fantasy Adventure will be 7.5 out of 10. As it's comparable to the Zelda series, I'll say I would sooner play this again than either of the first two Zelda titles. It has its Game Boy funk that not everyone will be able to appreciate, but this is a game worth playing. You're welcome for showing you the Palm Trees innate solution ahead of time. Other than this puzzle, I truly believe that this game can be figured out without a guide, it's just that I chose not to towards the end because it was getting slightly boring. Most of the game is more engaging. Now, you thought we were done with names for this game, but we're not. This game was remade twice, and both of them have different names. The GBA remake was named Sword of Mana, while the later mobile remake, also available on PS Vita, was named Adventures of Mana. I know very little about both of these, but I understand that Sword of Mana is often recommended by those who enjoy the original. As for what critics thought at the time of the release, it actually wasn't covered as much as I expected. Nintendo Power honored it with a 10-page preview, while their average score sat just below 4 out of 5. Famitsu seemed to cover any game on Nintendo consoles, but the trouble we now have is that not all of their old magazines are archived publicly. Wikipedia claims that they gave it a total score of 33 out of 40, or an average of 8.25 out of 10, but I have noticed Wikipedia's Famitsu scores to be incorrect before. From what I found, Electronic Gaming Monthly didn't even cover the original release in 1991, so I looked ahead to 2004 when they covered the remake Sword of Mana. It received a fair share of compliments for the action and GBA graphics, although only ended up with a 6 out of 10 on average due to the uncooperative partners and inefficient menus. If those flaws really weren't improved all those years later, I would be disappointed too. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, initially released in 1991? I hope you can build up your willpower to like the video and subscribe for more. My willpower will build up if I can get a better percentage of subscribed viewers. As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self.
A skeleton dragon.
Skeleton.
Skeleton in drag.